from the book of Matthew, chapter 28, verses 1 through 10. After the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning, Mary of Magdala came with Mary to inspect the tomb. Suddenly there was a severe earthquake, and an angel of God descended from heaven, rolled back the stone, and sat on it. The angel's appearance was like lightning, with garments white as snow. The guards shook with fear and fell down as though they were dead. Then the angel spoke, addressing the women. "Don't be afraid. I know you are looking for Jesus, the crucified, who is no longer here. Jesus has been raised exactly as it was foretold. Come and see the burial place. Then go quickly and tell the disciples that Jesus has risen from the dead and now goes ahead of you to Galilee. You will see Jesus there. That is the message I have for you." The women hurried away from the tomb with awe and great joy and ran to carry the good news to the disciples. Suddenly, Jesus stood before them and said, "Shalom." The women came up, embraced Jesus' feet, and worshiped. At this, Jesus said to them, "Don't be afraid. Go tell the disciples to go to Galilee, where they will see me." La palabra de Dios. Gracias a Dios.
Good morning. Happy Easter. It's Easter morning, but I'm going to start with a little bit of wildfire. For many of us who were here in the fall, late summer of 2020, you will remember the wildfires that surrounded our city. I remember standing in our neighbor's backyard and seeing the plume of smoke rising along the horizon and feeling it as it was kind of coming toward us. And the sky was orange and brown and gray. And the next morning, the smoke had enveloped us. And I had gone to drop my child off at daycare. And on the way home, I broke apart. That day, that year, was quite a year. And it felt, as I was dropping my child off, there was fire coming down on our city, engulfing our world in more ways than just one, in so many ways. And as I drove away from him, I thought, what am I doing? Sometimes the world that surrounds us, the physical, natural world, actually shows us what we're experiencing physically. Sometimes it feels that way. That's how it felt to me that day. Not only the pandemic, and not only the destruction of our bodies, right, by a virus, but our relationships with one another, the racism, the oppression that was surfacing, the ways in which that we were trying to protest, and those protests were trying to be stifled. All of that coming forth in these fires and in that smoke. In that way, when I read our gospel text for this morning about the earth quaking and the rock breaking in two in front of the tomb, if you read the text right before it of Jesus's death on the cross, the earth shakes then too. These are big moments. These are, I think of them as like hinge moments where our whole world is shifting. And so sometimes I find actually Easter a little bit challenging. I tend to dwell a little bit more in in the grief and the challenge. And I think about that a little bit more than I do about the hope sometimes. And as I was struggling to figure out what to say this morning, I realized that maybe part of what makes it challenging for me to talk about hope on Easter morning is also because I don't believe in the physical resurrection of Jesus. And as the person invited to preach on Easter morning at this tremendous earthquaking dawn, and even though I know that Christians believe all kinds of things about the resurrection, it feels like heresy to say it on Easter morning. Like, hey, maybe y'all, Jesus actually didn't rise again. But hear me out, hear me out. We start here. We know from our own lives and from our own experience that when the people we love die, they don't rise again. And I don't know why ancient people, even ancient people using the political title of the Son of God, might be different from us. It's really, truly one of the greatest tragedies of our lives, that when someone disappears from our life in that way, they're not coming back. And the reason it's a great tragedy is because although they are gone, our love for them is still right here, as alive as it was before. Our grief for them is here. Our frustrations with them, just as alive as they were before. Our longing for them is still right here. Nowhere to go, no one to hold on to it. So these past 6 weeks in Lent, at Salt and Light, we've been dealing with our grief. We've been working with it. We've been writing our grief down on strips of tissue paper. And I want to hold this up because then what happened was the children and Jane last week took those tissue paper strips and they made this out of it. Okay. A representation of our grief. And before the service, there were candles lit inside of here that have all, they're in there, but they melted. Hi, baby. I just have to keep preaching, sweet pea. So these last weeks of Lent, we've been dealing with our grief, and we've been naming it to one another in worship. And I told us all last week that we would set it down then. I've been asking us, we've been having these smaller circles. We've gone now to this large circle where we can look everyone at each other's faces. But before, we were sitting in smaller circles and we were being asked to tell each other, what is breaking your heart? So we're still here a little bit in the grief on Easter morning. And it's important because inside of our grief, like a tiny seedling curled up inside of it, is our love. And our love seedling is powerful. And that love has the power to change everything. So consider with me for a moment those early communities that were followers of Jesus. The ones who lived the lives behind the story that we read in Matthew. Those of whom we actually know so very little. This story being written at least 50 years after it actually happened. Just imagine with me for a moment, join with me in the wreckage following Jesus's death. The one thought to upend the empire is now dead. He was tortured, he was mocked, and he was executed. His movement was thought to be squashed by the powers that ended him. What seeds are planted in this grief as the two Marys arrive to the tomb? The grief, these seeds ran like invisible threads among all of those followers of Jesus. And so their movement began almost as whispers to one another. building on Jesus's teachings. Feed each other, heal each other, bring the margins to the center, love each other. Remember these things. They knew that when they gathered, when they remembered, when they loved, they brought Jesus into being right there among them. And it grew, this love, it grew unfurling like a fist to a palm in spite of the mess of it all, in spite of the hurt, in spite of the empty, or maybe even because of it. Because in our grieving lie seeds, waiting for the light, waiting for the love, waiting for us to tend to them. And so their movement grew one by one as they told more people, feed each other, heal each other, bring the margins to the center, love each other. For the healing of your heart, for the healing of all of our hearts, maybe for the healing of this world. One of the reasons I think that the physical resurrection doesn't quite land for me when I consider the resurrection story is that when I look to nature, life doesn't emerge that way. Destruction comes that way in big crashes, but life comes very small, very slowly. If you think about a seedling, in the early moments, just as it is beginning, one can hardly even think of it as life at all. It's just potential, encased inside of a shell. It waits hidden beneath the earth until the soil is warm enough and wet enough and the light is long enough that it beckons us up. It beckons the seed up toward the sky. I think that this is how resurrection emerged. Through the slow processing of grief, tending to it with love together. It came through the embodied remembrance together of Jesus and his teachings. The Roman Empire might have executed Jesus, but somehow he lives. When we stop to notice it, a seedling shows us how new life, new growth, comes not from striving, not from straining, but just by being, by simply existing, by opening, reaching and yearning, longing upward toward the light. Life persists because it longs for light in the mess of it all. We persist because we long for love in the mess of it all. It feels a little almost small to say it, but the grief that emerged for me after I dropped Connell off at daycare that smoky day in the midst of the wildfires cracked open something new for me around my love for the planet. And even just the smallest of changes, as I move through the world, I have to have trust that that makes a difference. Inside our griefs lie seeds of love, waiting for us to tend them, just waiting to grow. And so the promise of Easter is the promise of new life through love. The promise that even in the midst of death, love changes who we are, changes how we are. It's in even just a little more attentiveness to our consumption after the fury of wildfire smoke. It's in the person who bakes muffins every week for her homeless neighbors because she doesn't know what else to do after seeing the problem of houselessness. Because if nothing else, fresh, warm muffins can be made and shared. It's in the child who starts hormone therapy after a long season of being denied her truth. It's in the evicted tenant who organizes with her neighbor to be able to stay in her home. Love is in the addict who hits rock bottom and says, okay, let me try this out again. It's in the person who believes it when someone calls them out on their racism. It's in the one who just keeps trying to start each day as if it were new from inside a prison cell. It's in the one who's relearning the language of their ancestors. It's in the one who comes out after realizing they simply can't keep it in anymore. It's in those of us who are working for a better world in the smallest of ways, doing what is in our power to do, trusting that even those small things matter. Look at these everyday miracles that surround us. Finding that seedling of love, of yearning from within the depths of our griefs and germinating it to make something new and beautiful. That is resurrection. Here in the flesh among us all, and it is always available to any of us. Easter morning surrounds us this day. With every new leaf unfurling, with every muffin baked, with every truth expressed, here in the midst of it all, we find it. Love is the miracle. May that it be so. Amen. Okay. So we have a tradition here. Part of our culture and our community at Salt and Light Lutheran Church is that we practice sacred organizing. And part of our sacred organizing spiral is called Sacred Encounter, where we turn to one another and we do share in our deepest truths. This is optional. It's always optional, but we're going to take some time to about 5 to 7 minutes. And we're going to consider a question together with one other person who's sitting near you. And the question to consider today is, of course, what seed is inside of you waiting to be beckoned forth? What new life wants to be unfurled? So we'll take about 5 minutes. If you want to sit with yourself calmly and recall, you can do that. There's coffee and tea in the sunroom, and there are people surrounding you who are wanting to connect. Thank you.